shows that are based around real-life happenings. An American Horror Story, the famous television series, can be added to that list. Most of the program's characters were created using the inspiration from real events and people, and I've already talked about a few before, such as the Black Dahlia, Schlitzie, and Edward Mordache. But here are 4 people and a place that have been the inspiration behind the show, all of which have a grisly and dark history. Twisty the Clown is probably one of the scariest and freakiest characters of all. With his disturbing mask and murderous antics, he really is everyone's worst nightmare. And the fact that he is a clown makes him even creepier. So creepy in fact, that even the US's largest clown organization complained that American Horror Story is contributing to an increase in clown fear, which is already a very common phobia. To make matters worse, Twisty was based on a real-life clown, and his name was John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, who was a serial killer in the 1970s. Now, although this has not been confirmed, and many argue it's false, it's said during some of John's savage attacks he would be dressed up as his alter ego Pogo the Clown, which was an act he created in 1975. He would dress up as the clown and attend parties and events for some extra money. Gacy's crimes were truly horrific. He would target young men who were usually prostitutes or runaways, promising them work, then taking them back to his home and performing a variety of sick acts. Some were chloroformed, raped, and then strangled, and others were tortured and choked with their own underwear. His crimes came to an end in 1978 when he was investigated over the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy. After searching John's house in Des Plaines, Illinois, the police uncovered the horror of his crimes and he eventually confessed. He admitted he had lost count of how many he had killed, but police found 26 bodies buried in the crawl space beneath his home, which Gacy said he had intended to concrete over. 3 further bodies were found elsewhere on his property, and he admitted to discarding 4 of his latest victims' bodies in the nearby Des Plaines River. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders in total, although it's thought there are many more unconfirmed killings. In 1980, he was sentenced to death, and after spending 14 years on death row, was finally executed by lethal injection on the 10th of May 1994. Gacy showed no remorse for his crimes, and whilst awaiting execution, he created many pieces of artwork, most of which included skulls and Disney characters. After his death, some of these were sold off, with perhaps the strangest being a self-portrait depicting a clown that he labelled Goodbye Pogo the Clown. Delphine LaLaurie. Kathy Bates played Madame Delphine LaLaurie, the sadistic mother and slave owner in American Horror Story, who shows no remorse for the hideous way she treats her slaves. So, how accurate is her portrayal, and was the real Delphine LaLaurie really that cruel? Born in 1775, Delphine was brought up in a time when slavery was perfectly acceptable, and it was normal to use extreme discipline. At the time of her 3rd marriage to a French physician, Louis LaLaurie, she owned at least 54 slaves. She kept them chained up and gave them the bare minimum rations to survive, despite complaints from her friends and relatives about the barbaric treatment. She continued to incarcerate her slaves in wretched conditions, and it was reported she would beat her children if they tried to feed them. Then, in April 1834, a fire broke out at the LaLaurie residence. The fire was in the kitchen just below the slave quarters, and neighbours became concerned about the chained-up slaves being trapped and burned. After Delphine refused to hand over the keys to the slave quarters, the door was broken down. This is when they discovered the appalling conditions the poor slaves were living in. They were tightly chained together and their bodies were covered in scars and open wounds. Apparently, 7 of the men were horribly mutilated and found suspended by their necks with their limbs stretched and torn. One of the men also had a gaping hole in his head that was apparently filled with worms. It's been said that the fire that led to the discovery of the slaves' barbaric conditions was deliberately started by a 70-year-old lady who was the cook, who was found chained to the stove by her ankle. She said she started the fire as a suicide attempt as she feared she was going to be sent for punishment in one of the upper rooms, and said that any slave who entered this room was never seen again. Shortly after the discovery, the LaLaurie home was ambushed by angry locals, and Delphine fled and is thought to have lived out the rest of her days in Paris, where she died and was buried sometime in the 1840s, before being exhumed and reburied in the St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans. Although there is no actual record of her grave there, in the 1930s a man found an old copper plaque in one of the alleys at the cemetery, and Delphine LaLaurie's name was inscribed on it, stating her place of death was in Paris on the 7th of December 1842. Jimmy Darling. Jimmy Darling was a main character in the 4th season of Freak Show. And just a quick rundown of him, he is the illegitimate child of the bearded lady and the strongman. He has a condition called ectrodactyly, which means he has a deformed claw-like hand with digits missing, which earned him the stage name Lobster Boy. His deformities have been exploited all his life, with even his birth being a paid-for stage show. He is forced to perform in the Freak Show and can only dream of leading a normal life. But when some of his fellow performers are threatened, he viciously slits the throat of a policeman. His life spirals out of control when he is accused of being a mass murderer, and in a cruel twist, the lawyer trying to prove his innocence cuts off Jimmy's hands and sells them to the Museum of Curiosities. It's long been thought that Jimmy Darling was based on real-life ectrodactyly sufferer Grady Stiles Jr., who himself was a freak show performer called Lobster Boy who was born in 1937. His deformity was more extreme than Jimmy's, with both his fingers and feet fused together to form claw-like extremities. Grady was one of a long line of family members with the condition who all travelled around the country performing circus acts, earning them a very good living. And although Grady did marry and father 4 children, 2 of which were also affected with the condition, he, much like Jimmy Darling, dreamed of a normal life. Unhappy with the way things were, he became very abusive to his family and turned into a chronic alcoholic. And although unable to walk due to his deformity, he had developed incredible upper body strength. And this strength, combined with his violent temper and alcoholism, made him a very dangerous man. Things took a more violent turn after his eldest daughter got engaged to a man who Grady did not approve of, so he shot him with a shotgun on the eve of their wedding and killed him. Due to his disability, Grady was not jailed for his crime and instead was given 15 years probation. For a short time he stopped drinking and remarried his first wife, but soon fell back into alcoholism and became even more abusive, until in 1992 his wife had had enough. She paid a 17-year-old $1,500 to kill him. Shortly after, Grady was shot in his own home by his wife's hitman. In her defense, his wife said, "My husband was going to kill my family. I believe that from the bottom of my heart. I'm sorry this happened, but my family is now safe." If you are aware of this story and its link to American Horror Story, then you may already know that in the opening credits of Freak Show, a small statue appears with an unnerving likeliness to Grady. And also a snapshot of him can briefly be seen at the American Morbidity Museum in episode 3. The Axeman. The Axeman was a jazz musician who played the saxophone in various clubs throughout New Orleans. He was featured in Series 3 of American Horror Story and was a serial killer whose preferred weapon was of course an axe. He was killed in 1919 by the Coven to stop his reign of terror, but in the present day he is brought back through an Ouija board. While this character is actually based on a real serial killer known as the Axeman of New Orleans, who carried out a terrifying killing spree between May 1918 to October 1919. He would chisel his way into his victim's home, usually through the back door, before butchering the occupants with an axe, and one time a straight razor which he used to cut the victim's throat from ear to ear. In total, 8 murders were attributed to him, but there could have been many more. Most of his victims were Italian, and the killings caused an enormous amount of panic in the community. The scared citizens would stay in at night and would visualize the mad Axeman behind every corner. The already frightened community was scared once again on Friday the 14th of March 1919, when a strange letter was sent in to the editor of the New Orleans Times, supposedly written by the killer. It stated that he would kill again at 15 minutes past midnight on the night of March the 19th. But would spare those who played jazz music in their homes. That night, the clubs and bars of New Orleans filled to capacity and played jazz music all night long. But since some citizens did not attend and did not play jazz music in their homes, police believe the letter could have been a hoax since no one was killed that night. The Axeman was never caught by the police, but his crime spree stopped as mysteriously as it started, when a man by the name of Joseph Mumphrey, who had long been associated with the murders, was supposedly killed in 1920 by the widow of one of the Axeman's victims, and after this there was a sudden end to the killings. The whole story of the New Orleans Axeman is very long and complicated, so is probably worth a documentary, but that is the real story and inspiration behind American Horror Story's Axeman. The Cecil Hotel. Hotel is the much anticipated 5th season of American Horror Story, and the plot centers around the strange and bizarre happenings that take place at the fabricated Hotel Cortez set in Los Angeles. The hotel has a different horror lurking behind every door and is filled with demons, ghosts, and curses. So it's no surprise that the inspiration behind the hotel comes from old hotel horror films, but mainly the infamous Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles that was opened in 1925. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know this hotel is most famous for the place where Elisa Lam was mysteriously found dead in the rooftop's water tanks. But the hotel has also been plagued with seedy encounters, murders, and suicides, all of which were the inspiration behind the new season. For starters, the hotel was once home to the American serial killer Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, who terrorized Los Angeles in the 1980s, and was convicted of 13 murders. During his murderous period, he lived in a $14 a night room on the top floor of the Cecil Hotel, and after slaughtering his victims, he would dump his bloody clothes in the hotel's dumpster before returning to his room. Another serial killer, Jack Unterweger, stayed at the hotel in 1991 for 5 weeks, and during this time he murdered 3 prostitutes by strangling them with their own bra straps. In 1964, Goldie Osgood, also known as Pigeon Woman due to a love of feeding birds, was found stabbed, raped, and strangled in a ransacked room at the hotel. And to add to the hotel's reputation, her murder still remains unsolved. As well as murders, the hotel has also been associated with suicides. In 1962, Pauline Otten threw herself to her death from the 9th floor and landed on a passing pedestrian, killing him instantly. The hotel has also been a place where ghost enthusiasts go to investigate, and Ouija boards and demonic rituals are a common practice there. The Cecil Hotel has since rebranded its name to Stay on Main, but this certainly hasn't stopped it from being a ghoulish tourist attraction. And with this new season of American Horror Story, the hotel has been filled with hordes of fans, often requesting to book the room Elisa Lam stayed in before her mysterious death.